He is a revered prophet, a freer of slaves, a hero of the Bible. He is the father of the Israelites, Moses. Moses' destiny: lead his people to the promised land of Canaan by any means necessary. This is a new look at Moses and the Exodus story. He talks to God, but he's also a brilliant general. He doesn't just lead slaves, he commands an army of mercenary warriors. During the Israelites' 40-year march across the desert, Moses and his army fight battles of biblical proportions and defeat some of the deadliest armies of the ancient world. Moses is a master tactician. Moses is an unrelenting commander. Moses is on the warpath to the promised land. The 14th century BC. Under a sweltering sun, Israelite slaves build Egypt, one brick at a time. If they fail, they suffer the consequences. But the Israelites are about to meet their savior. His name is Moses, and his story begins with murder. Exodus chapter 2, verse 11. When Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk and witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. He turned this way and that, and seeing no one about, he struck down the Egyptian.
Moses is significant, not only as a great political leader of the Israelites, but he really is the Israelites' first great general. A good reading of the Exodus book of the Bible reveals a first-rate military mind, a commander who knew how to organize troops, how to fight them strategically and tactically, and a man who practiced deception in the military sense, almost as great as any other general in history.
After Moses murders the Egyptian and buries him in the sand, he flees Egypt, escaping into the Sinai Desert.
This is a great turning point in Moses' life, according to the Bible. He has sealed his fate in Egypt and is about to start on a path that will ultimately lead him to a great confrontation with Pharaoh, resulting in the Exodus from Egypt.
After living many years in the desert, God puts Moses on a path of bloodshed and brutality. God appears as a burning bush and commands Moses to return to Egypt and free the tens of thousands of Israelites from bondage.
And he does exactly that. He goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." Pharaoh refuses. Then Moses unleashes the fury of God in 10 devastating plagues.
Hail crashes from the sky. Water turns to blood. And the angel of death kills every firstborn Egyptian child.
It's like an apocalyptic car movie, and Moses, acting as God's mouthpiece, is running the show. Finally, Pharaoh admits that he's beaten, and he frees the Israelites. Now, you'd think that would be the end of the story, roll credits, but suddenly the Pharaoh changes his mind and orders the army to hunt them down and stop them.
God, now in the form of a pillar of smoke and fire, miraculously leads Moses and the Israelites out of Egypt. Then comes one of the most famous miracles of the Bible, the parting of the Sea of Reeds. This is how the Bible explains the Israelites' escape from Egypt. They continue to Canaan, where they eventually claim the land as God-given. But this is just one version of the Exodus story.
It's a great story, and is the foundation upon which Judeo-Christianity is based. God leads the Israelites from bondage to a promised land. You get the whole Passover story and everything. Now, if we stop and retell this story from a military perspective, from a soldier's point of view, we get a very different, a very violent picture.
The real question of trying to understand this retelling of the Exodus is, who are the Israelites? What are they doing in Egypt? And why doesn't Pharaoh want them to leave?
According to the Bible, the Israelites originally migrated from the land of Canaan into Egypt some 2 centuries before Moses' time, around the 14th century BC. They settled in the land called Goshen, a fertile, prosperous area near the border.
And the Bible tells us that they live here for 200 years peacefully coexisting with the Egyptians. But in fact, there are those who believe that the Israelites are more than just coexisting. There's a theory that the Israelites were actually major military players in the defense of Egypt.
This theory comes from reading the Exodus story as a military campaign. Some believe the Israelites might be the same people as the Habaru, a group that includes merchants, construction workers, and farmers, as well as ferocious warriors. If true, the Israelites are likely in the land of Goshen for a very definite reason: to help defend the Egyptian border against attacks from the north.
So the Habiru military mercenary arm can be put in Egyptian service as auxiliary troops settled across that key avenue of invasion to act as a tripwire and defensive troops in the event of an invasion from Canaan.
The powerful Habiru mercenary army is about 1,000 strong. Soon, a new pharaoh rises to power and sees the fighting force as a threat. And he said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them, so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground."
Pharaoh Seti launched several wars to reassert Egyptian authority over Syria and Canaan. Now, when he looks at the route from Canaan to Egypt, what does he see? Israelite settlements. The Israelites have been living on the border for about 200 years, and Seti knows they were originally immigrants from Canaan.
As Egypt's military grip on the land of Canaan slips, Pharaoh Seti fears the Israelites in Goshen will join the Canaanite fight against Egypt.
Now, he didn't expel them. What he did is he set them to labor.
This is the part of the Exodus story when many believe the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites. But that may be historically inaccurate.
In the Christian translation of the Hebrew Bible, the text tells us that the Israelites were set to slavery in the field, making bricks for Pharaoh's cities. But the Hebrew Bible doesn't say any such thing. What the Hebrew Bible doesn't mention the word slavery. It says instead that the Israelites were set to labor and uses the Hebrew term avadim. Avadim means workman or construction worker, or in a technical sense, what we call corvée laborers.
Corvée laborers are recruited to build public works projects like city walls and fortifications. While they may have been forced to work, some believe they are not slaves.
Now you can imagine that if the Israelites are held in fairly high regard as essentially the first line of Egyptian defense, and then suddenly are demoted to common workers, this might not go over too well. So after several years of this, the Israelites decide it's time to go. But when they leave, they may not be just a ragtag group of slaves. If the Habiru theory is correct, these are people who are skilled fighters with the military capability of causing some pretty serious damage.
Now, historians disagree, but likely the Pharaoh at the time when Moses comes and says, "Let my people go," is Ramses II. And after the plagues and all the drama, Ramses finally concedes to Moses. Then, 25,000 or so Israelites, divided into their 12 tribes, the famous 12 tribes of Israel, flee Egypt.
The great exodus out of Egypt begins. But soon, Pharaoh mysteriously changes his mind and launches his army in pursuit of the Israelites. The Bible provides a clue as to why he does this. The Israelites had done Moses' bidding and borrowed from the Egyptians objects of silver and gold and clothing. And the Lord had disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people, and they let them have their request. Thus they stripped the Egyptians.
It says that the Israelites lacked provisions, and so they simply asked the Egyptians for them, and the Egyptians gave them the provisions they wanted, including gold and silver. Well, this is a story that's really not believable, and if you read the Hebrew Bible, the phrase or the term that is used to describe what happened is nitzayel. Nitzayel means to strip or despoil. Whatever was being given was certainly being taken at the point of a sword.
The first steps to the Promised Land are paved with blood. The great Israelite exodus out of Egypt has begun, and it's not a peaceful exit. Some believe that the Israelites sack an Egyptian city on their way out of the country.
They're in a land which is surrounded by, or literally infested with, what we call store cities, small supply depots. It's also the place in Egypt of the giant cattle-raising estates. So here are the provisions all around them. Okay, so what the smart thing might have been would have been to essentially sack one of the estates and provision themselves.
The Bible says Moses leads the Israelite slaves out of Egypt, but some military historians believe he commands a mercenary group of skilled warriors.
There are those who believe that the Israelites are this semi-nomadic group called Habiru, and one of the things Habiru are known for are their military skills.
Pharaoh, who had let Moses and the Israelites leave Egypt, now orders his army to hunt them down and destroy them.
The Bible says the Israelites leave Egypt boldly and defiantly. Well, certainly one way to show defiance is to take what you need on your way out.
But even more evidence in the Bible points to a pretty tough Israelite group. It says they had weapons.
The children of Israel went up armed out of the land of Egypt.
If you read the Hebrew text of the Bible, what it tells you is, in fact, that the Israelites were armed to the teeth.
Their arsenal includes the short spear, about 6 feet in length. Its stabbing point is made of sharpened bronze. And the slashing bronze sickle sword, the most popular and deadly weapon of the day. After sacking the city, Moses leads the Israelites toward Canaan. But as he approaches an Egyptian outpost, Moses discovers that Egyptian chariots are in hot pursuit and closing fast.
He's got an anvil to his front and a hammer closing on the back. He calls his commanders together and then gives an order that must have struck some as almost insane. He tells them to turn off the road and head into the southern desert.
This appears to be suicidal. But Moses knows this desert. He spent most of his adult life here, and he's got a plan.
If we look at Exodus as a battle, what we see is a level of military sophistication that's truly amazing. Moses takes his understanding of the desert terrain and uses it to go up against the most powerful army of the time, Egypt.
Egypt in the 14th century BC is at the height of its power. It is a time known as the New Kingdom, and its power reaches north to Mesopotamia. But according to the Bible, Moses receives help against the mighty Egyptians. The Lord went before them in a pillar of cloud by day to guide them along the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they might travel day and night. Behind this divine intervention may be inspired military strategy.
Although the Bible portrays the pillar of smoke and fire as essentially a divine totem, perhaps even the Lord himself or the angel of the Lord, in point of fact, it's nothing more than a common command and control device used commonly by Egyptian armies of the day.
Ancient Egyptian artifacts show how fire and smoke are used to lead and direct enormous armies spread out over great distances. At the head of the column, soldiers carry long poles with braziers or fire containers on top.
In a world before night vision goggles, GPS, and radios, you need a way to keep your troops together in the dark. The Egyptians use fire. At night, the brazier is uncovered to serve as a beacon to follow. In the morning, the brazier is half covered to send out a smoke signal and tell the army it's time to move out. In fact, Alexander the Great, when he conquered Egypt years later, adopted this technique.
Moses likely uses this Egyptian method of signaling to keep the Israelites on the move.
That night, the pillar of smoke turns into the pillar of fire, signaling to the Israelites that it's time to make camp. The Egyptians see this, and it doesn't surprise them because they know what it means, time to make camp. They make camp themselves a couple hundred yards away because it's night and they didn't want to fight at night. But what does surprise the Egyptians is the placement of the fire.
The Bible tells us Pharaoh is there. Not sure whether he would have been or not, but we'll follow the Bible on this. He sees this and probably doesn't think anything of it. Israelites are just making camp, except that the fire is closest to him relative to the entire Israelite camp. If the fire is at the head of the marching column, then the Israelites should be between Pharaoh and the fire. But it's not. It's closest to him.
It appears that the Israelites are heading in the wrong direction, back to Egypt. Behind, the Sea of Reeds traps them. Pharaoh will say of the Israelites, they are astray in the land. The wilderness has closed in on them.
Now, from the Egyptian perspective, the Israelites are lost. They're moving deeper into Egypt than they should be. They're not going to escape this way. What a bunch of stupid people, the Egyptians must have thought. Well, they didn't count on the brilliance of a first-rate tactical mind, and that is that Moses has set about deceiving them in any number of ways.
Moses is about to perform a magic trick. He's going to make 25,000 Israelites disappear right before the Egyptians' eyes.
The ruse begins with the placement of the pillar of fire. The Israelites aren't heading in the wrong direction. Moses has turned his people around so the fire is now at the rear of his column. The purpose is to both deceive and blind the Egyptians.
Modern soldiers are taught what we call night discipline. When you're moving at night, the one thing you must do is avoid looking into a bright light, because it has to do with the cones and rods of your eye, the way the eye functions. But if you look into a bright light at night, it can take 30 minutes up to an hour before you can see again, at least see clearly. So as long as that flame was burning in front of the Israelite camp, as best we know, it burned all night, the Egyptian soldiers from the camp several hundred yards away were functionally blind. They couldn't see beyond that light.
Under this cover, the Israelites escape across the Sea of Reeds.
Everyone immediately thinks of Charlton Heston in the film Ten Commandments. He raises his arms and the sea splits right down the middle. It's iconic, but it's also a fantasy. So what really happened? Well, remember Moses spent a lot of time out in this desert and knows the Reed Sea very well. He would probably be aware that at a certain location at a specific time of day, it can be crossed on foot.
Moses' timing is perfect. They likely cross about 20 miles south of the Mediterranean, where the Sea of Reeds is a tidal swamp. As the Israelites approach, the tide rolls out. The Bible then states the wind begins to blow.
Now, that wind is blowing from the southeast, out of the deserts of the Sudan. Blows from the southeast at the same time as the tide goes out, pulling it north. Within a small amount of time, that marshland of perhaps several hundred yards long suddenly is empty of water, or at least the water is at such a low level that you could easily walk across it.
Perhaps it's not a heavenly miracle, but it's still an amazing escape. To pull it off, Moses brings together his knowledge of the terrain, tides, wind conditions, and Egyptian tactics. And he has to keep 25,000 Israelites together who are not used to marching through the wilderness. If you've ever been hiking in a group, you know that's a miracle in itself.
Daybreak. Pharaoh Ramses is in for a surprise. The Israelites have safely crossed the Sea of Reeds, and the water begins to flow back into the marsh.
By the time the Egyptians get to the Reed Sea, the tide is rolling in. They can probably see the Israelites on the other side, so they chase after them. But chariots are too heavy for the soft, mucky swamp. They get stuck.
Moses triumphs over the mighty Egyptians, succeeding with a brilliant military strategy and without raising a sword.
He has avoided a superior force, deceived it into thinking he was going one way, gone the other way, and done it all because he had an intimate knowledge of the terrain upon which he had to operate. And he had that knowledge of the terrain because he spent 40 years wandering, if we can believe the Bible, attending flocks in that area. As was said of the Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo, he said, "I've had this piece of land in my pocket for a long time." My guess is Moses had this piece of land in his pocket for a very long time as well.
But the Exodus campaign has only just begun. 3 months into the journey, a tribe of people called the Amalekites launch a surprise attack against Moses and the Israelites.
The Amalekites are a hostile tribe that roams the Sinai Peninsula and southern Canaan. They fight on camelback, firing arrows at their enemies and cutting them down on the run.
Moses has just outsmarted the Egyptians, but his challenges have only just begun. Next, he will lead the Israelites into a fight against a new and unexpected enemy. It's the great Exodus out of Egypt, and the Israelites have just made a daring escape. But now, only 3 months after crossing the Sea of Reeds, Amalekite warriors ambush the Israelites from behind.
Moses does something interesting. Instead of leading the Israelites himself, he watches the battle from the nearby hilltop. The Bible says that every time Moses raises his religious staff above his head, the Israelites win. But if he lowers the staff, they lose. Now, we don't know if this is some kind of signal or source of inspiration to his men, or perhaps a ruse to make the Amalekites think he has hidden forces behind the hill. But Moses definitely directs the battle in some way.
With Moses on the hill, control of the army falls into the hands of another great Israelite hero of the Bible, Joshua.
The Israelites fix their spear into the ground at a 45-degree angle to defend against the oncoming Amalekite camels. This stops the immediate onslaught, and the fight descends into a hand-to-hand splatterfest.
The Amalekites launch a ferocious assault. From the hill, however, Moses inspires Joshua and the Israelites to battle the Amalekites. Despite being exhausted from the journey, the Israelite soldiers fight furiously and put down the Amalekite onslaught. It's a tremendous victory, but Moses knows there are much greater obstacles ahead.
Moses is a realist. Sure, his guys just beat up on a raiding party of Amalekites. But if he tries to invade Canaan with 1,000 men, he's going to have trouble. So, instead of heading towards the Promised Land, he leads his people south towards Mount Sinai.
Moses understands he needs a larger, more sophisticated, and better trained army. But more soldiers means they'll need to manufacture more weapons.
Why is Moses heading toward Mount Sinai? We really don't know the answer because the texts are silent. But what we do know is that a Canaanite group called the Kenites live there. And they're known to be metal workers, and the area around Mount Sinai is known to be a giant, large mine for copper. Copper and tin make bronze, and that's what the weapons of the day are made of.
When you smelt bronze, at a certain point in the process, the copper emits a dazzling green flame. I could imagine the Israelites marching into this Tolkien-like Middle-earth type scene where these weird green flames were illuminating Mount Sinai.
Many Israelites are angry about the detour.
The Israelites complain bitterly about their conditions in the desert on the way to Mount Sinai. They're hungry, they're thirsty, they're exhausted. You've got to remember there are women and children here on this trek. How are they going to eat? What are they going to eat? To get them to leave Egypt, Moses promised the Israelites a land of milk and honey in Canaan. But what they get is sand, marsh water, attacks, and spooky mountains.
The Israelites are on the brink of an open rebellion against Moses and his leadership.
What happens in the Bible is whenever you have a revolt of the people and a punishment of the people, it's always cast in ritualistic terms, that they did something against God's will. But in point of fact, I mean, far more likely is that people are just angry, horrified. Things aren't going well. Here we are in the desert. I mean, it says in the Bible, what are we doing following you, Moses? We should have gone back to Israel, gone back to Egypt. There we had fish, we had melons, we had onions. What do we got here? Nothing, so to speak. So very human emotions of maintaining power.
While the furious Israelites rage, the Bible says Moses climbs Mount Sinai. There, he receives 10 commandments from God.
But he might also go up there to figure out what his next move is. How can he control his followers? Who can he trust? What will he need to invade Canaan?
The Bible states that Moses remains on Mount Sinai for 40 days. When he finally comes down, he carries the stone tablets of God's law, the 10 commandments. But when Moses reaches his people, he's stunned by what he sees.
He finds that the people have created a terracotta or clay idol covered over with gold, and they're worshiping the golden calf. He's furious.
Enraged that his followers are worshiping idols, Moses destroys the commandment tablets. He then calls together the men of the Levite tribe. His orders: teach the unfaithful a brutal lesson.
He summons the Levites to him, it says. Every man put your sword on your thigh and go from tent to tent, killing even your relatives and brothers. And 3,500 died that day.
Moses turns the Levites into a Praetorian Guard, personal bodyguards beholden only to him. They do whatever he says, and oftentimes that means killing his own people to keep the rest in line.
The Levites execute a terrible justice.
We're not exactly sure why God or Moses chooses the Levites to do this business. There's nothing that's special about them except that they are the priests. It's likely that their religious conviction can never be swayed.
This is the start of Moses as divine dictator. Up until now, the structure of the Israelite tribes has been very democratic. But now Moses has a direct line to God, and that's the end of all debate.
Phase 1 of the Exodus campaign is complete, and Moses' tactical plan has been brilliant. Phase 2, the conquering of the promised land of Canaan, will require a large-scale invasion. For that, he needs more than his 1,000 mercenary soldiers.
What he does is he institutes essentially a conscript draft from each tribe. And that's a great reform because it now means that Israel no longer has just a made-up army of mercenaries.
Using population data, historians believe the conscription likely swells the army ranks from 1,000 to about 5,000 warriors. Forward reconnaissance teams scout the enemy. Heavy infantry form close battle lines in front. Light infantry are positioned in the middle to flank, defend, and move out in front for quick strikes with swords and shields. Slingers and archers are next in line to fire at the enemy from a protected position. And at the back of the column, Moses places another division of heavy infantry for defense. It takes 2 years for Moses to train and shape his 5,000 soldiers into a deadly fighting force.
Except for chariots, which the Israelites don't have, Moses creates a mirror image of the Egyptian army. He knows how effective Egypt's coordinated attacks are and wants the same capabilities for his own army when he invades Canaan.
His army is ready. His control is absolute. Moses is ready to conquer Canaan. The promised land of Canaan. Rich and fertile, it has everything the Israelites want and need for their new homeland. Moses and the Israelites have been on the march toward Canaan for 2 years. But Canaan is a land already settled by powerful city-states, with strong armies and fortified cities. It's not free for the taking.
The Israelites have no intention of settling in Canaan as long as there are other people still in Canaan. They intend to attack cities and drive them out and to replace their populations with their own population. This is a war of extermination.
Moses leads his followers to a large oasis in the desert called Kadesh Barnea, about 12 miles from Canaan. Here, Israelite spies who have been scouting Canaan return with both good news and bad.
They come back and meet with Moses at Kadesh Barnea, and they say, this is an impossible task. The cities are walled, the armies are powerful, they have chariots, they have armor, weapons, they have food. It would be impossible for our army to do this.
Moses determines that even his 5,000-man army isn't big enough for the job. The invasion must wait.
And so the Bible tells us they remained at Kadesh Barnea for 2 generations, which has been translated to mean 40 years. And in that time, of course, what would have happened is that the 25,000 or so people of the Israelite nation would have replenished themselves through normal birth rates, so that by the time 2 generations had passed, you're probably looking at a community of about 35,000, which would now allow you, with a conscript base, drawing on all adult males between the ages of, say, 20 and 35, to produce an army between 8,000 and 9,000 men.
The Bible states that finally, 40 years after the start of the Exodus campaign, Moses is ready to launch his attack against Canaan. He has trained his army well. They are a powerful fighting force. But Moses wants to fight on his terms, using tactics and strategies he first learned in Egypt and has been training with for more than 40 years. Walled Canaanite cities block the route north from Kadesh Barnea, and a direct assault could destroy Moses' army before he ever gets to the Promised Land. So instead, he marches the Israelites east towards the Jordan River Valley.
Moses knows that your strategy should dictate your tactics, not the other way around. His goal is to get to Canaan with the largest force possible, which means he should avoid fights along the way whenever possible. For Moses, the path of least resistance to Canaan is through the Jordan River Valley. But there's still one problem.
A mighty tribe stands in the way of Moses and the Israelites, the Ammonites.
There's no way around them. Moses has the Dead Sea on one side and a harsh desert on another. His only way to the Jordan Valley is through the Ammonites. They're a somewhat softer target than the Moabites or the Edomites.
Moses isn't stupid. Diplomacy first. So he asks the Ammonite king's permission to pass through his country. The Ammonite king says, "No way." Moses turns and calmly walks away. The battle is on.
Moses again turns to Joshua to command the army on the battlefield. The Israelites line up opposite the Ammonites on the open plain. Moses watches as the 2 armies clash. Moses' army has been training for years. Today, they finally draw blood. The Israelites' heavy infantry smashes into the Ammonites' front lines. Bones are shattered. Limbs are hacked. The light infantry's bronze sickle swords slash mercilessly. The grass is soon slick with blood. The battle rages all day. But in the bloody end, Moses' well-trained army wins the battle.
We think that both armies are about the same size. So, what accounts for the Israelites' overwhelming victory? It comes down to training and tactics. We know that the Israelite army is built upon an Egyptian model, divisions of varied forces that can fight as one. They're likely more mobile, more agile, and more disciplined than anything the Ammonites had ever seen.
With the Ammonites destroyed, Israelites sweep through the Jordan Valley. They attack and ravage Canaan's neighbors in the lands of Edom, Moab, and Gilead. So the Lord our God also delivered into our power King Og of Bashan with all his men, and we dealt them such a blow that no survivor was left.
One element of the Jordan Valley campaign that stands out is its brutality. Again, the Bible describes what happened when these fortified towns were taken. It was often great slaughter, burning, destroying of the towns and flocks and animals. And so you ask yourself, why the need? Why the need for this kind of brutality?
The Israelites don't want to live in the Jordan Valley. They're moving on to Canaan. So the worst thing they can do from their perspective is to leave a hostile force at their back as they push forward. The only way to make sure this doesn't happen is to wipe out the population. Ruthless, yes, also practical.
Not just the men are slaughtered, women and children are also killed. But before they march into Canaan, Moses will turn against a people who have been his allies for 40 years. Moses' army, some 8,000 to 10,000 ruthless warriors, has cut a swath of destruction through the Jordan Valley. They now face the Midianites, a longtime Israelite ally. These are the people who took Moses in after he killed the Egyptian taskmaster. They are the people who Moses called family. His wife is a Midianite. Now, Moses gives a brutal order: destroy them.
A couple of Israelite men were sleeping with a couple of Midianite women. That by itself probably wasn't a problem from Yahweh's perspective, but they had now begun to worship Midianite gods, and they had turned their back on Yahweh. So Yahweh orders the children of Midian to be killed and puts Moses in charge of the operation.
Every Israelite soldier, led by a commander named Phinehas, marches to the Midian camp.
They destroy everything. They butcher all the men, burn all the houses, loot anything of value. The only thing Phinehas can't bring himself to do is kill the women and children.
The Midianite camp is completely destroyed, but Phinehas can't bring himself to follow Moses' orders to kill women and children. So he marches them back toward camp.
Before the army even makes it back to camp, Moses rushes out in a fury and yells at Phinehas, "I told you to kill them all." He demands that every boy and every woman old enough to have slept with a man must die right then and there.
They are all executed.
This is all a prelude to the invasion of Canaan, and Canaan will be a tougher nut to crack than the tribal societies of the Jordanian Valley. Best now to train the army for the horror it will face in the future.
When the bloodletting ends, the ritual cleansing begins. The Bible states that any Israelite soldier who draws blood in battle must stay outside the camp for 7 days.
And this probably doesn't just mean physical cleansing. They might also use that time to cleanse their guilt. The horror of what they've done to other people would have left deep psychological scars. And they would, in all likelihood, suffer from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder.
It's intriguing to raise the question about the effect of all this up-close and personal bloodletting would have had on the morale and psychological stability of the Israelite soldiers.
Many believe Moses used brutal methods in his long campaign to toughen the Israelites for the invasion of Canaan. But it's an invasion that Moses never gets to be part of. That very day the Lord spoke to Moses, "Ascend these heights of Abarim to Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab facing Jericho, and view the land of Canaan, which I am giving the Israelites as their holding. You shall die on the mountain that you are about to ascend.
The Bible tells us that God lets Moses see Canaan from the top of Mount Nebo, but doesn't let him enter. Why? After everything that Moses has done in the service of God, it seems like cosmic injustice that he's denied entrance to the Promised Land. The only explanation the Bible gives is that one time Moses showed a lack of faith and struck a rock with his staff in frustration. And it makes you think, wow, the Old Testament God is strict, but come on. So, one has to wonder, what's really going on here?
Some historians believe that there's another reason why Moses never sets foot in the Promised Land.
There'd been a lot of suffering and a lot of bad decisions made on this great trek. The extermination of peoples such as the Midianites and attacks, plus attacks on their own Israelites by Moses and his Praetorian God of the Levites, that there's been some speculation that the real reason Moses never made it to the Promised Land is that he was killed by his own people, that they just had enough of this and just rose up and killed him.
As to the murder theory, the Bible is silent.
There's not a scintilla of evidence to support this perspective. It just seems that it's a kind of logical consequence to ask, why would a God kill a servant who has spent 40 years or more in his service for what seems to be a minor ritual sin of striking the rock with one's staff? So it's the illogic, it's the almost absurdity of the biblical explanation that has led scholars to speculate that Moses have met his end at the hands of his own people rather than at the hands of Yahweh himself.
Regardless of how Moses dies, the conquest of Canaan will fall to a new generation. The Israelite general Joshua continues the brutal but effective strategies of Moses in his quest to conquer Canaan. And many centuries later, there are examples of his ability to outmaneuver his enemy without actually fighting, as he did when the Israelites escaped the Egyptians.
One example is Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce Indian tribe. 1877, 2,000 U.S. cavalry tried to force the tribe around 800 back onto the Indian reservation. The tribe fights back against overwhelming odds and leads the U.S. cavalry on a 1,000-mile chase through some of the harshest wilderness in America.
At one point, the U.S. General Sturgis believes he has Chief Joseph trapped. But like Moses, Chief Joseph feigns one way and moves another to allow his people a chance to escape. Unlike the Israelites, however, the Nez Perce are eventually captured.
The exodus of the Israelites under the leadership of Moses has always been a story of a dazzling escape and a desperate battle for survival. But now, seen through a military perspective, the Israelites are no longer slaves, but mighty warriors. They are held together by one towering personality.
We never think of Moses as a military commander because until recently there has been no attempt to analyze the Bible in military terms. But when you do look at it that way, you'll find that this was a man who organized the Israelites, which had a completely trained military arm, on his way out of Egypt. This is a man who sacked the city, a man who deceived Pharaoh, and then later on completely reformed the Israel military arm into a first-rate fighting force.
Moses is a man of God and a man of the sword, a man who led his people to freedom and to a new homeland.